Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had been invisible for 3 years. Every morning at 500 hours, she walked through the gates of Fort Henderson in her faded maintenance uniform, carrying a worn toolbox that had seen better decades. The other soldiers barely noticed her. To them, she was just another face in the motor pool, another pair of hands to fix their broken equipment. At 32, Maria had the quiet strength of someone who had learned to keep her head down and her mouth shut. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a regulation bun, and her brown eyes held secrets that she shared with no one. She spoke with a slight accent that reminded people she had grown up in East Los Angeles, far from the rolling hills of Georgia, where Fort Henderson sat like a small city unto itself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the base as Maria made her way to Building 47, the maintenance facility that had become both her sanctuary and her prison. The building was old, built in the 1960s, with concrete walls that kept the Georgia heat at bay and the noise of her work contained. Inside, rows of military vehicles waited for her attention. Humvees with blown transmissions, trucks with failing brakes, and the occasional piece of specialized equipment that only she seemed able to fix. "There goes the grease monkey," Sergeant First Class Tommy Burke called out from across the motor pool. His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never been challenged. "Hey Santos, my truck's making a funny noise. Think you can handle something that complicated?" Maria didn't look up from the engine she was working on. She had learned long ago that responding only made things worse. Burke was the kind of soldier who wore his rank like a weapon, using it to cut down anyone he perceived as beneath him. He was popular with the other NCOs, the kind of man who told loud jokes in the mess hall and always seemed to know someone important. "I'm talking to you, Santos," Burke pressed, walking closer. His boots clicked against the concrete floor with military precision. "You deaf or just stupid?" "I heard you, Sergeant," Maria replied without looking up. Her voice was steady, professional, put in a work order like everyone else. Burke's face flushed red. He wasn't used to being dismissed, especially not by someone he considered beneath his notice. "You got some attitude for a mechanic. Maybe you forgot your place around here." Maria finally looked up, her eyes meeting his with calm determination. "My place is fixing things that are broken, your truck included." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Other soldiers had stopped what they were doing to watch the exchange. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed to enjoy the show. But Maria had been through this dance too many times to let it rattle her. She turned back to her work, her hands steady as she adjusted a bolt that had been giving her trouble. Burke stood there for a long moment, clearly wanting to escalate the situation but unsure how to do it without looking foolish. Finally, he spat on the ground near Maria's toolbox and walked away, muttering something about women not belonging in the army anyway. As the day wore on, Maria lost herself in her work. She had always been good with machines, ever since she was a little girl helping her father fix cars in their driveway back in LA. There was something honest about mechanical problems. They had solutions, clear causes and effects. Unlike people, machines didn't lie or play games or hold grudges. Around lunchtime, Private First Class Jenny approached Maria's workstation. Jenny was barely 19, fresh out of basic training and still trying to find her place on the base. She looked nervous as she cleared her throat. "Sergeant Santos," Jenny's voice was small, uncertain. "I was wondering if you could help me with something." Maria looked up, wiping grease from her hands with an old rag. Jenny was one of the few people on base who treated her with respect, maybe because she was too new to have absorbed the casual prejudice that seemed to infect everyone else. "What's the problem?" "It's my personal car," Jenny said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "It's making this weird grinding noise, and I can't afford to take it to a real mechanic in town. I know you're not supposed to work on personal vehicles, but—" Maria studied the young soldier's face. She saw herself at that age, scared and trying to make ends meet on military pay that barely covered the basics. "Bring it by after-duty hours," she said quietly. "I'll take a look." The relief on Jenny's face was immediate and genuine. "Thank you, Sergeant. I really appreciate it." As Jenny walked away, Maria felt a familiar tug in her chest. It was the same feeling she got every time she helped someone, the satisfaction of fixing something that was broken. But it was also tinged with sadness, because she knew that her kindness would never be returned by the people who really mattered on this base. The afternoon brought its usual parade of broken equipment and casual insults. Maria had learned to tune out most of it, focusing instead on the rhythm of her work. She had developed a reputation as someone who could fix anything, though she rarely got credit for it. When a repair went smoothly, the requesting officer took the praise. When something went wrong, the blame somehow always found its way back to her. As the day shift wound down, Maria began cleaning her tools and organizing her workspace for the next day. The maintenance bay was quiet now, most of the other mechanics having left as soon as the clock hit 1700 hours. She preferred it this way, alone with her thoughts and the gentle hum of the building's ventilation system. She was just about to leave when her supervisor, Master Sergeant, appeared in the doorway of his office. Was a decent man, fair but distant. He had been trying to retire for 2 years, but the Army kept extending his contract because good maintenance supervisors were hard to find. "Santos, got a minute?" Maria walked over to his office, her boots echoing in the empty building. The office was small and cluttered, filled with repair manuals, work orders, and the accumulated paperwork of 30 years in the Army. "Close the door," said, and Maria's stomach tightened. Conversations that started this way rarely ended well. "I've been getting complaints about you," said without preamble. He was looking at a file on his desk, not meeting her eyes. "Attitude problems, insubordination, failure to show proper respect to senior NCOs." Maria felt her jaw clench, but she kept her voice level. "What specific incidents, Master Sergeant?" "Burke says you disrespected him this morning. Refused a direct order and got mouthy when he called you on it." The injustice of it hit Maria like a physical blow, but she had learned to absorb these hits without showing pain. "I told him to put in a work order like everyone else. That's not insubordination, that's following procedure." Finally looked up at her and she saw something like sympathy in his eyes, but sympathy didn't change the reality of military hierarchy. "Look, Santos, I know you're a good mechanic. Hell, you're probably the best I've got, but you need to understand how things work around here. Burke's got friends, connections. You don't." The words hung in the air like smoke. Maria understood perfectly. She had always understood. Being good at your job only mattered if the right people noticed, and the right people had never paid attention to a quiet Latina mechanic who fixed their problems without complaint. "Am I being written up?" she asked. "Not this time," said. "But I need you to be more careful. Keep your head down, do your job, and try not to make waves." Maria nodded and left the office, walking through the empty maintenance bay toward the parking lot. The Georgia sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded her of home. She sat in her car for a long moment, letting the emotions wash over her frustration, anger, and a deep, bone-deep exhaustion that came from fighting a battle she could never win. But as she drove through the base gates and headed toward her small apartment off base, Maria Santos had no idea that everything was about to change. She couldn't know that the skills she had learned in another life, skills she had buried so deep that sometimes she forgot they existed, would soon be the only thing standing between Fort Henderson and a disaster that would make the evening news. The invisible soldier was about to become the most important person on the entire base. Maria's apartment was a study in careful simplicity. 1 bedroom, 1 bath, furnished with the bare essentials and nothing that would draw attention or questions. The walls were mostly bare except for a single photograph on the nightstand, a picture of her parents standing in front of their small house in East LA, both of them smiling despite the hardships that had marked their faces. She heated up a frozen dinner and ate it while watching the local news, a habit she had developed to keep track of the world beyond Fort Henderson. The anchor was talking about rising tensions overseas, the same conflicts that had been simmering for years. Maria listened with the detached interest of someone who had once cared deeply about such things but had learned to keep that caring locked away. After dinner, she pulled out a small metal box from under her bed. Inside were documents that told a different story than the one in her official military personnel file. Letters of commendation, certificates from training programs that didn't officially exist, and photographs of her with people whose faces had been carefully blacked out for security reasons. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, motor pool mechanic, was not who she appeared to be. Her real name was Maria Santos, but the woman eating frozen dinners in small-town Georgia was just one version of herself. 10 years ago, she had been Sergeant First Class Santos, Special Operations, with clearances so high that even mentioning them was a felony. She had been part of a unit that didn't appear on any organizational charts, soldiers who were sent to places that didn't exist to do things that never happened. She had been good at her job. Better than good, she had been exceptional. Maria could move through enemy territory like a ghost, speak 4 languages without an accent, and eliminate targets with the cold precision of a surgeon. Her superiors had called her a natural, someone born for the shadows and the silence. But that life had ended on a dusty road outside a village whose name she still couldn't speak aloud. The mission had gone wrong in ways that haunted her dreams. Good people had died because of intelligence failures and political calculations made by men in suits who would never smell gunpowder or hold a dying soldier's hand. When the dust settled and the after-action reports were filed, Maria had been offered a choice: accept a promotion and a new assignment, or disappear into the regular army and never speak of what she had done. She had chosen disappearance, but the choice had cost her everything: her rank, her identity, and her sense of purpose. The transition from special operations to motor pool mechanic had been brutal. Maria had gone from being one of the Army's most elite soldiers to being just another face in the crowd, her skills and experience reduced to footnotes in a classified file that would never see daylight. But she had endured it, day after day, year after year, because the alternative was facing the memories that lived in the dark corners of her mind. Now, sitting in her quiet apartment, Maria ran her fingers over the commendations and certificates that represented the person she used to be. Sometimes she wondered if she had made the right choice. Sometimes she wondered if the Maria Santos who could disappear into shadows and eliminate threats was the real one, and the mechanic was just an elaborate disguise. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Maria quickly closed the metal box and slid it back under the bed, her movements automatic and precise. Few people knew where she lived, and fewer still would visit unannounced. She looked through the peephole and saw Jenny standing in the hallway, fidgeting with her car keys. Maria opened the door, noting that the young soldier looked even more nervous than she had that afternoon. "Sorry to bother you at home, Sergeant," Jenny said. "I know it's weird, but I brought my car like you said." Maria looked past Jenny to the parking lot, where a small sedan sat under a streetlight. "It's fine, let me grab my tools." They walked out to Jenny's car, and Maria immediately heard the problem: a grinding noise coming from the front wheels that spoke of brake pads worn down to nothing. It was the kind of repair that could save someone's life, the difference between stopping safely and sliding through an intersection. "How long has it been making this noise?" Maria asked as she popped the hood. "A few weeks," Jenny admitted sheepishly. "I kept thinking it would get better on its own." Maria smiled despite herself. Machines don't heal themselves. They just get worse until someone fixes them or they break completely. As she worked, changing brake pads by the light of the, Jenny talked about her life growing up in rural Montana, joining the army to pay for college, feeling lost and overwhelmed in her first assignment. Maria listened with half her attention, the other half focused on the rhythm of the repair. But something in the young soldier's voice reminded her of herself at that age, full of hope and determination despite the obstacles. "Why did you join the army?" Jenny asked suddenly. Maria paused in her work, considering how much truth to share. "My parents came to this country with nothing," she said finally. "The army gave me a chance to serve something bigger than myself." It wasn't a lie exactly, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was classified at levels that would remain secret long after both women were dead. "Do you ever regret it?" Jenny asked. Maria tightened the last bolt and lowered the car's hood. "Everyone regrets something. The trick is figuring out what you can live with." As Jenny drove away with properly functioning brakes, Maria stood in the parking lot and felt the familiar weight of her divided life. By day, she was the invisible mechanic, absorbing insults and fixing problems that others created. But in the quiet hours, she was still the person who had learned to move through darkness and make hard choices. She had no way of knowing that both versions of herself were about to be tested in ways she couldn't imagine. The next morning brought the routine that had governed Maria's life for 3 years. Up at 4:30, coffee and a piece of toast, dressed and out the door by 500. The drive to Fort Henderson took 15 minutes through streets that were mostly empty except for other early shift workers and the occasional police patrol. But as she approached the main gate, Maria noticed something different. There were more guards than usual, and they were checking IDs more carefully. The military police sergeant, who usually waved her through with a casual nod, was studying her credentials like he had never seen them before. "Everything okay, Sergeant?" Maria asked as he handed back her ID card. The MP's face was professionally neutral, but she could see tension in his shoulders. "Just elevated security protocols, Sergeant Santos. Have a good day." Inside the gate, Maria noticed other subtle changes. More patrols walking the perimeter, additional security at key buildings, and a general atmosphere of heightened alertness that spoke of a threat assessment she wasn't privy to. In her old life, she would have known exactly what was happening and why. Now, she was just another soldier wondering what the brass knew that they weren't sharing. At the maintenance facility, the morning briefing was shorter than usual. Master Sergeant looked tired and distracted as he handed out the day's work assignments. Maria's assignment was routine: a Humvee with transmission problems and a generator that needed rewiring. But as she settled into her work, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was an instinct developed over years of operations where the difference between paranoia and survival was measured in heartbeats. The bass felt different, like a guitar string wound too tight, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Around mid-morning, she overheard a conversation between two officers that made her blood run cold. They were talking in the low, urgent tones that people used when discussing classified information in public spaces, thinking they were being careful. Confirmed surveillance of the perimeter. Unknown number of hostiles. Lockdown protocols if necessary. The words hit Maria like electric shocks. In her old life, she had been part of the planning for base security, knew the protocols and procedures that most soldiers never saw. What she was hearing suggested that Fort Henderson was under some kind of external threat, the kind that turned military bases into targets. She forced herself to continue working, her hands steady even as her mind raced through possibilities. A terrorist cell planning an attack, foreign operatives conducting reconnaissance, or worse, an inside threat, someone with access and knowledge planning something catastrophic. Maria had spent 3 years trying to forget the skills that had once defined her. But those skills were like muscle memory, dormant but never truly gone. As she worked on the Humvee's transmission, part of her mind was already conducting a threat assessment, cataloging vulnerabilities and calculating response times. By lunchtime, the tension on the base was palpable. Soldiers were talking in clusters, sharing rumors and speculation. The mess hall buzzed with nervous energy, the kind that preceded either combat deployments or emergency drills. Maria sat alone at her usual table, eating a sandwich and listening to conversations around her. Most of what she heard was speculation and fear, but occasionally someone would drop a detail that fit into the larger picture she was building in her mind. Saw them bringing in extra ammunition for the guard posts. My buddy in communications says they're monitoring all radio traffic. Heard they're expecting some kind of VIP visit, but nobody knows who. A VIP visit would explain the increased security, but something about it didn't feel right to Maria. She had provided security for high-ranking officials before, and this felt different. More urgent, more dangerous. As she was finishing her lunch, Sergeant Burke appeared at her table with his usual swagger and casual contempt. "Well, well," he said, his voice loud enough to carry to nearby tables. "Look who's sitting all by herself. What's the matter, Santos? None of your grease monkey friends want to sit with you." Maria looked up at him with the same calm expression she always wore. "Just enjoying my lunch, Sergeant." "Yeah, I bet you are," Burke continued, clearly looking for an audience. "Must be nice, sitting here while real soldiers worry about real problems, but I guess you wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" The casual cruelty in his voice was nothing new, but something in Maria's chest tightened anyway. Burke had no idea who he was talking to, no concept of the things she had done in service of the same flag he claimed to defend. But she had learned long ago that the truth was a luxury she couldn't afford. "If you have a work order, Sergeant, I'll be happy to help you," she said evenly. Burke's face flushed with anger at the dismissal. "You know what your problem is, Santos. You don't know your place. Maybe it's time someone taught you." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Maybe it's time you learned some respect." Maria felt something shift inside her, a familiar coldness that she had thought was buried forever. For a moment, she saw Burke not as an annoying NCO but as a target, calculating the pressure points that would drop him before he could react. It would be easy faster than he could process what was happening. But instead, she simply stood up, gathered her trash, and walked away without a word. Because Maria Santos, motor pool mechanic, was not allowed to fight back. Only the other Maria could do that, and she was supposed to stay buried. As she walked back to the maintenance facility, Maria had no idea that by the end of the day, the buried part of herself would be the only thing standing between Fort Henderson and a tragedy that would echo far beyond the Georgia hills. The afternoon was about to become the longest of her life. The call came at 14:30 hours, just as Maria was finishing the generator repair. Master Sergeant's voice crackled over the base communication system with an urgency that made every soldier stop what they were doing. "All personnel implement lockdown procedures immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Maria's hands stilled on her tools. Lockdown procedures meant the base was under immediate threat, either from external forces or an internal security breach. Around her, the other mechanics looked confused and frightened. Most of them had never experienced anything more dangerous than a training exercise. Within minutes, the maintenance facility was sealed according to protocol. Heavy steel doors rolled shut, emergency lighting kicked in, and the building's ventilation system switched to filtered air mode. They were now in a hardened bunker, designed to protect personnel and equipment from everything from chemical attacks to conventional explosives. Emerged from his office, his face grim as he addressed the dozen soldiers now trapped with him in the facility. "Listen up, people. We've got reports of armed hostiles on base. Unknown number, unknown location, unknown intentions. Our job is to sit tight and wait for the all clear." "What about weapons, Master Sergeant?" asked Corporal Williams, one of the younger mechanics. His voice cracked slightly with nervousness. "We're maintenance personnel," replied. "We're not equipped for combat operations. The MPs and security forces will handle this." Maria said nothing, but her mind was already working through the implications. Fort Henderson was a logistics base, not an installation. The security forces were adequate for normal operations but not equipped to handle a sophisticated attack. If hostiles had penetrated the perimeter, they had either been very lucky or very well prepared. The lights suddenly went out, plunging the facility into darkness before the emergency systems kicked in. In the red glow of the backup lighting, Maria could see the fear on her colleagues' faces. These were good soldiers, but they were mechanics and drivers, not combat troops. Radio crackled to life. "All stations, this is base command. We have multiple breaches of the perimeter. Estimated 12 to 15 hostiles with military-grade weapons and equipment. All non-essential personnel are to remain in lockdown until further notice." 12 to 15 hostiles was a small number for a conventional attack, but Maria knew it could be devastating if they were well-trained and had inside knowledge of the base layout. Her fingers unconsciously traced the scar on her left wrist, a souvenir from a mission where she had faced similar odds with much better support. The radio continued. "Be advised, hostiles appear to be targeting specific infrastructure. Power grid is compromised. Communications are limited. Security forces are responding, but casualties have been reported." Maria closed her eyes and let her training take over. She mapped the base in her mind, identifying the most likely targets and the most efficient routes between them. If the attackers were professionals, they would go for the armory first, then communications, then the command center. But there was another possibility that made her blood run cold. She said quietly, moving closer to the master sergeant, "What's in Building 12? Looked puzzled by the question. "Building 12, that's just storage mostly, some old equipment, spare parts." "Why?" "What kind of spare parts?" "Chemical detection equipment mostly. Some old stuff from when this was a training facility for chemical warfare defense. Been meaning to have it disposed of properly, but you know how bureaucracy works." Maria felt her stomach drop. Chemical detection equipment often meant chemical storage as well, materials that could be repurposed by someone with the right knowledge. If the attackers knew about Building 12, they weren't just looking to cause casualties. They were looking to create a disaster that would make national headlines. The radio crackled again, this time with a voice that carried the strain of combat. "Base Command, this is Security Team Alpha. We've lost contact with Teams Bravo and Charlie. Hostiles are moving toward the northern sector. Request immediate backup." The northern sector, that's where Building 12 was located. Maria made a decision that would have been impossible for the mechanic, but came naturally to the soldier she used to be. She moved to his equipment locker and began pulling out items, a flashlight, wire cutters. "Santos, what the hell are you doing?" demanded. "Someone needs to check on Building 12, Maria said, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "If they're targeting chemical storage, we need to know." "Absolutely not," said firmly. "You're not security personnel. You stay here like everyone else." Maria looked at him with eyes that held depths he couldn't fathom. "Master Sergeant, I need you to trust me on this. There are things in my background that aren't in my personnel file, things that qualify me to handle this situation." Stared at her, seeing something in her demeanor that he had never noticed before. The quiet mechanic was gone, replaced by someone who carried herself like a weapon. "What things?" "The kind that are classified above your pay grade," Maria replied. "But I'm telling you now, if those hostiles get into Building 12 and they know what they're looking for, this whole base becomes a toxic waste site." The lights flickered again, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear the sound of gunfire. Looked around at his frightened soldiers, then back at Maria. He was a good NCO, but he was also smart enough to recognize when he was out of his depth. "What do you need?" he asked. Maria was already moving toward the facility's secondary exit, a maintenance tunnel that connected to the base's utility system. "Keep everyone here and maintain radio contact if possible. If you don't hear from me in 2 hours, assume the worst and implement whatever evacuation procedures you have." Santos called after her, "Who the hell are you really?" Maria paused at the tunnel entrance, her silhouette framed by the red emergency lighting. "Someone who should have stayed buried," she said quietly. The tunnel system beneath Fort Henderson was a maze of concrete passages and utility lines that most soldiers never saw. Maria moved through it with the fluid grace of someone who had navigated hostile territory in complete darkness, her enhanced senses picking up sounds and air movements that would have been invisible to others. As she made her way toward Building 12, fragments of radio chatter reached her through the base's communication system. The security forces were taking heavy casualties, hampered by the power outages and the attackers' apparent knowledge of base defenses. Whoever these hostiles were, they had planned this operation with military precision. Maria emerged from the tunnel system near Building 12 and immediately went into reconnaissance mode. The building appeared intact from the outside, but there were signs of forced entry at the rear door. More concerning, there were drag marks in the dirt leading away from the building, evidence that someone had removed heavy objects. She approached the building with all the stealth skills that had once made her one of the Army's most effective operators. The rear door had been expertly breached, the lock mechanism disabled with the kind of precision that spoke of professional training. Inside, Building 12 was chaos. Storage containers had been ripped open and their contents scattered across the floor. But Maria's trained eye immediately spotted what was missing: specific chemical compounds that, when combined properly, could create weapons of mass destruction. She was photographing the scene with a small camera when she heard voices approaching. Maria melted into the shadows between storage racks, her body automatically assuming a combat stance that felt as natural as breathing. 3 men entered the building, all of them armed with military-grade weapons and equipped with night vision goggles. They moved with the coordination of a trained unit, but there was something about their bearing that told Maria they weren't regular military. "Package secured," one of them spoke into a throat microphone, "moving to secondary objective." The secondary objective. Maria's blood chilled as she realized what that meant. The chemical compounds were just the beginning. These men had another target somewhere on the base. She watched as they left the building, then followed at a distance that would have been impossible for anyone without her specialized training. The hostiles moved toward the base's water treatment facility, and Maria understood with horrible clarity what they were planning. The chemicals from Building 12, introduced into the water supply, would poison every person on Fort Henderson within hours. It would be a massacre disguised as an industrial accident. As she shadowed the attackers through the darkness, Maria Santos, the mechanic, finally died completely. What emerged from the shadows was someone far more dangerous, a ghost who had been trained to eliminate threats to national security with extreme prejudice. The invisible soldier was about to become visible in the most dramatic way possible. For the first time in 3 years, Maria Santos was going to war. Maria followed the 3 hostiles through the maze of base buildings, staying in their blind spots with the effortless precision of someone trained in battlefield surveillance. Her mind, their equipment, their movement patterns, and their weaknesses with the cold efficiency of a targeting computer. The leader was military trained, probably special forces based on his point position and hand signals. The other 2 were competent but less disciplined mercenaries or contractors rather than professional soldiers. All 3 carried automatic weapons and enough ammunition for a prolonged engagement. But Maria had advantages they couldn't know about. She knew every inch of Fort Henderson, every shadow and blind corner. More importantly, she had been trained to kill people exactly like them. The water treatment facility loomed ahead, a concrete structure surrounded by chain-link fencing and warning signs. It was the perfect target, isolated enough to avoid immediate detection, but critical enough to cause maximum damage. If the hostiles succeeded in contaminating the water supply, the death toll would be measured in hundreds. Maria watched from concealment as the team leader cut through the perimeter fence with bolt cutters. They moved with practiced efficiency, clearly working from detailed intelligence about the facility's layout and security measures. This wasn't a random terrorist attack. It was a carefully planned operation with specific objectives. As the hostiles disappeared into the treatment facility, Maria made her approach. The fence they had cut provided her entry point, but she chose a different route, scaling the fence at a corner where shadows would conceal her movement. Her body moved with muscle memory developed over countless training exercises and real-world operations. Inside the facility, Maria could hear the hostiles working to access the main water lines. They were professionals, but they were also focused on their technical objective. That focus would be their weakness. Maria drew on skills she had hoped never to use again. She moved through the facility like smoke, using the ambient noise of the water treatment equipment to mask her approach. Her first target was the rear guard, a nervous-looking man with a scar across his neck who kept checking his six instead of maintaining proper overwatch. She took him down with a blood choke that rendered him unconscious in seconds, lowering his body silently to the concrete floor. His weapon and ammunition became hers, evening the odds slightly. The second hostile was more challenging, alert, and positioned with good sight lines across the main treatment area. But Maria had learned patience in places where impatience meant death. She waited until he moved to check on his teammates' progress, then struck from his blind side with the precision of a surgeon. By the time the team leader realized he was alone, Maria had positioned herself between him and his exit routes. She emerged from the shadows with his teammates' weapons trained on him, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had done this many times before. "Drop your weapon and step away from the equipment." The leader was a professional. Instead of panicking, he assessed the situation with the calm calculation of someone trained for exactly this scenario. Maria could see him weighing his options, the distance to cover, the likelihood of a successful shot, the possibility of completing his mission even if he died in the attempt. "You're not base security," he said, his accent suggesting Eastern European origins. "Who are you?" "Someone you weren't briefed about," Maria replied. "Last chance, drop the weapon." Instead of complying, the leader reached for something at his belt, a dead man's switch connected to the chemical devices he had been installing. If he released it, the contamination would happen regardless of whether he lived or died. Maria shot him through the wrist before he could activate the switch, the report of the rifle echoing through the concrete facility. The leader dropped to his knees, clutching his shattered hand and staring at Maria with a mixture of pain and professional respect. He asked through gritted teeth, using the Russian term for special forces. "Close enough," Maria replied, keeping the weapon trained on him while she secured the chemical devices with her free hand. The equipment was sophisticated military-grade dispersal systems that would have turned the water supply into a weapon of mass destruction. As she worked to disarm the devices, Maria's radio crackled to life with his voice. "Santos, what's your status? We're hearing gunfire from your direction." "Package secured," Maria replied, using the hostiles' own terminology. "But we've got bigger problems. This wasn't just an attack, it was a diversion." She looked down at the wounded leader, who was watching her with the calculating gaze of a professional. "How many more teams?" she asked. He smiled despite his pain. "Enough." Maria's blood ran cold as she realized the full scope of the operation. The assault on Fort Henderson had never been about the base itself. It had been about drawing security forces away from the real target. Somewhere else, other teams were carrying out the primary mission, while the base's defenders were focused on the wrong threat. But what was the real target? The answer came through her radio as relayed a message from base command. Santos, they're saying the attacks here were just a diversion. The real target is the federal building in downtown Columbus. There's a joint terrorism task force meeting there tonight. FBI, Homeland Security, military intelligence. If they hit that building. Maria closed her eyes as the full horror of the situation became clear. The attack on Fort Henderson had been designed to cripple the region's security response and create chaos. While local law enforcement and military resources were tied up dealing with the base assault, the real attack would proceed unopposed. Hundreds of federal agents and military personnel would die, along with any civilians unlucky enough to be in the building. It would be the worst terrorist attack on American soil since 9/11. How long until the meeting starts? Maria asked. 2 hours, replied. But Columbus is 40 minutes away and with the base in lockdown. Maria looked around the water treatment facility, then down at the wounded hostile leader who was still watching her with professional interest. She had neutralized the immediate threat to Fort Henderson, but the larger operation was still in motion. She could stay on base, follow protocol, and let someone else handle the situation in Columbus. It would be the safe choice, the choice that wouldn't expose the classified skills she had spent 3 years trying to bury. Or she could do what she had been trained to do: identify threats to national security and eliminate them with extreme prejudice. She said into the radio, "I need you to contact whoever's in charge of base security. Tell them I have intelligence about the Columbus operation, and I need immediate transportation and support." "Santos, your maintenance personnel, they're not going to." "Tell them," Maria interrupted, "that they have a former special operations soldier on base and she's offering to help. Give them this code, Black Angel 77. There was silence on the radio for a long moment. Black Angel 77 was a designation that existed in the deepest levels of military classification, known only to a handful of people with the highest security clearances. It identified soldiers who had operated so far in the shadows that their very existence was by official channels. "Jesus Christ, Santos," his voice came back, filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Who the hell are you?" Maria looked down at the wounded hostile, who had gone pale at hearing the code designation. He knew what Black Angel meant, which told her more about the sophistication of this operation than any interrogation could have revealed. "Someone who's been hiding too long," she replied. Within minutes, Maria's radio was buzzing with activity as her code designation worked its way up the chain of command. The response was immediate and dramatic. A helicopter was being scrambled to extract her from Fort Henderson, and federal agencies in Columbus were being briefed on the imminent threat. But as Maria prepared to leave the water treatment facility, she realized that her 3 years of invisibility were over. After tonight, there would be no going back to the quiet life of a maintenance mechanic. The ghost was about to step back into the light, with all the consequences that would bring. She looked around the facility one last time, then began her journey back through the base toward an extraction point that would change everything. The helicopter that extracted Maria from Fort Henderson was a military variant she recognized from her previous life: fast, quiet, and equipped for special operations. As it lifted off into the Georgia night, she could see the base spread out below her, emergency lights cutting through the darkness like scattered stars. Sitting across from her in the helicopter's cramped interior was Colonel James, a man whose presence told Maria everything she needed to know about how seriously her intelligence was being taken. Was Pentagon brass, the kind of officer who only appeared when national security was at stake. "Staff Sergeant Santos," said, his voice barely audible over the helicopter's rotor noise. Or should I say, former Sergeant First Class Santos, Black Angel 77. Maria met his gaze without flinching. I haven't used that designation in 3 years, Colonel. No, you haven't, agreed, consulting a tablet that displayed her classified personnel file. Officially, Maria Santos ceased to exist in 2022 after the Kandahar incident. Unofficially, she's been fixing trucks in Georgia. The Kandahar incident. Maria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with those memories. Good soldiers had died because of intelligence failures and political calculations. She had requested to be buried in the regular army rather than continue operations that put politics ahead of soldier safety. What's the situation in Columbus? She asked, deflecting away from the past. His expression grew grim. Federal building, downtown. Joint Terrorism Task Force meeting starting in 90 minutes. 200 federal agents, military intelligence personnel, and support staff. If the hostiles succeed, it'll be the worst attack on American soil since 9/11. What do we know about their capabilities? Based on what you encountered at Henderson, we're dealing with professional operators, probably a mix of foreign special forces and high-end mercenaries. They've had months to plan this operation, and they know our response protocols. The helicopter banked sharply as it approached Columbus, the city lights spreading out below them like a galaxy. Maria could see the federal building in the distance, a tall structure that dominated the downtown skyline. It would be a target-rich environment for anyone with the right training and equipment. What's my role in this? Maria asked. Looked at her with the calculating gaze of someone weighing options. Officially, you don't exist. This conversation never happened and you were never on this helicopter. Unofficially, you're our best chance of stopping this attack before it starts. The helicopter touched down on the roof of a building 3 blocks from the federal building. Maria was met by a team of FBI agents who looked like they had been pulled from other assignments and briefed on the run. Their leader, Agent Sarah, had the tired eyes of someone who had spent too many years fighting an invisible war. Agent FBI Counterterrorism, she said, extending her hand. Colonel says you have actionable intelligence. Maria shook her hand, nodding the calluses that spoke of weapons training and field experience. The attack on Fort Henderson was a diversion. The real target is the meeting tonight. The hostiles have chemical weapons and the training to use them. His face went pale. Chemical weapons, what kind? Military-grade dispersal systems, probably designed to be introduced through the building's ventilation system. The death toll would be total. Around them, the FBI team was setting up a mobile command center with satellite links and real-time surveillance feeds. Maria watched them work with the professional appreciation of someone who had done similar operations in much more hostile environments. What's building security like? She asked. Standard federal protocols, replied. Metal detectors, X-ray machines, armed guards. But if these are the professionals you think they are, they'll have planned for standard security, Maria finished. They'll either have inside help or alternative entry methods. Pulled up building schematics on a tablet, and Maria studied them with the focused intensity of someone trained to identify vulnerabilities. The federal building was a modern structure with multiple entry points, underground parking, and a complex ventilation system that could be exploited by someone with the right knowledge. Here, Maria said, pointing to a maintenance access point in the building's lower level. If I were planning this operation, I'd pre-position personnel and equipment through the service tunnels, hit the ventilation system from below, then extract through the same route. Can we stop them? Maria looked around at the FBI team, good agents but not equipped for the kind of warfare she expected to encounter. Not we, she said quietly. Me. Absolutely not, replied immediately. You're not a federal agent, I can't authorize. Agent, Colonel interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Sergeant Santos is operating under military authority. Your job is to provide support and coordinate with local law enforcement. Looked like she wanted to argue, but she recognized a losing battle when she saw one. Instead, she turned back to Maria with professional resignation. What do you need? Floor plans, ventilation schematics, and whatever weapons and equipment you can spare. And I need you to delay the start of that meeting for as long as possible. I can give you maybe 30 minutes, said. After that, too many people will notice. Maria nodded, already mentally preparing for what lay ahead. She had spent 3 years trying to forget how to do this, but the skills were still there, waiting like muscle memory. The ghost was about to walk into the light one more time. As the FBI team worked to gather intelligence and coordinate with building security, Maria equipped herself with gear that felt familiar in her hands: tactical vest, night vision goggles, and weapons that had been designed for close-quarters combat. Each piece of equipment brought back memories of operations in places that didn't exist, against enemies who had never officially been there. Sergeant said, approaching her as she checked her equipment, I want you to know that what you're doing tonight won't go unnoticed. When this is over, there will be recognition for your service. Maria looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much. I'm not doing this for recognition, Colonel. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. Even if it means giving up the quiet life you've built. Maria considered the question, thinking about her small apartment, her routine at Fort Henderson, and the safety of invisibility she had cultivated for 3 years. Then she thought about the 200 federal agents and support staff who were walking into a death trap without knowing it. Some things are more important than a quiet life, she said. As she prepared to enter the federal building through the same service tunnels the hostiles would use, Maria Santos made peace with the fact that the woman who emerged from this operation would be different from the one who went in. The mechanic who had hidden in plain sight was gone forever. In her place stood someone far more dangerous, a ghost with a mission and the skills to complete it. The invisible soldier was about to become legendary. Maria descended into the service tunnels beneath the federal building like she was returning home. The underground maze of concrete passages and utility lines felt familiar, reminiscent of a dozen similar operations in a dozen different countries. Her enhanced senses, sharpened by years of special operations training, picked up the subtle signs that others had been here recently. Fresh scratches on the concrete walls where equipment had been moved, the faint chemical smell of military-grade explosives, and something else, the lingering presence of fear and determination that preceded violent action. Moving through the tunnels with the fluid grace of a predator, Maria followed the signs deeper into the building's infrastructure. Her night vision equipment painted the world in shades of green, revealing details that would have been invisible to normal vision. She was no longer Maria Santos, maintenance mechanic. She was Black Angel 77, and she was hunting. The first hostile she encountered was positioned at a junction of service tunnels, armed with an automatic weapon and sophisticated communications equipment. He never saw her coming. Maria eliminated him with the silent efficiency of someone trained to kill without hesitation, appropriating his radio and learning that the operation was already in motion. Through the stolen radio, she heard voices coordinating in what sounded like Russian, confirming her suspicions about the international nature of this attack. The hostiles were moving equipment into position throughout the building's ventilation system, preparing to release chemical agents that would turn the federal building into a tomb. Maria moved deeper into the complex, eliminating sentries and gathering intelligence with the methodical precision of someone who had done this countless times before. Each hostile she encountered was better trained than the last, confirming that this was indeed a professional military operation disguised as terrorism. In the building's main mechanical room, she found what she was looking for: the central command post for the operation. 3 men in tactical gear were monitoring building security through hacked surveillance feeds, while coordinating the placement of chemical dispersal devices throughout the ventilation system. Maria watched from concealment as they worked, counting weapons, identifying their leader, and calculating the best approach for neutralizing the threat. These were professionals, but they were focused on their technical objectives. That focus would be their weakness. She moved like smoke through the mechanical room, taking down the first two hostiles before they realized they were under attack. The team leader was more alert, spinning toward her with his weapon raised, but Maria had anticipated his reaction. She put him down with a precision shot that ended the threat without damaging the crucial equipment around them. But as she worked to disarm the chemical devices, Maria's radio crackled with a transmission that made her blood run cold. There was a fourth team she hadn't accounted for, and they were already in position in the building's main conference room, where the terrorism task force meeting was about to begin. Maria raced through the building's service corridors, using her knowledge of the schematics to take the most direct route to the conference level. But she was too late. As she emerged from a maintenance access point, she could hear the sounds of automatic weapons fire from the direction of the meeting. The conference room was chaos when Maria arrived. Federal agents were taking cover behind overturned tables, while hostiles in tactical gear laid down suppressing fire from defensive positions. The chemical attack had been abandoned in favor of a more direct assault, but the result would be the same mass casualties among America's counterterrorism leadership. Maria assessed the situation with the cold calculation of someone trained for exactly this scenario. The hostiles had superior position and firepower, but they were focused on the agents in front of them. They weren't expecting an attack from their flank. She moved into the conference room like an avenging angel, her weapon speaking with the voice of professional violence. The hostiles were skilled, but they had never faced someone with Maria's particular combination of training and experience. One by one, she eliminated them with the precise efficiency of a surgeon removing a cancer. When the last hostile fell, the conference room was filled with stunned silence. Federal agents emerged from cover, staring at the woman who had appeared from nowhere to save their lives. Maria stood among the bodies of her enemies, smoke still rising from the barrel of her weapon, looking like something from their darkest nightmares turned protector. Agent was the first to find her voice. "Who are you?" she asked, echoing the question that had followed Maria throughout her military career. Before Maria could answer, Colonel entered the conference room with Master Sergeant, and to Maria's surprise, Sergeant Burke from Fort Henderson looked around at the carnage with the wide eyes of someone seeing combat for the first time, but Burke's expression was different, a mixture of shock, fear, and dawning understanding. "Ladies and," announced to the room full of federal agents, "I'd like you to meet Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, formerly Black Angel 77, one of the most decorated special operations soldiers in U.S. military history." The room buzzed with whispered conversations as agents tried to process what they had witnessed. Maria stood silent in the center of it all, feeling exposed in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "For the past 3 years," continued, "Sergeant Santos has been working in maintenance at Fort Henderson, having requested reassignment to regular duties following the classified Kandahar incident. Tonight, she single-handedly prevented what would have been the worst terrorist attack on American soil since 9/11. Burke stepped forward, his face pale with the realization of how badly he had misjudged the woman he had spent months tormenting. "Sergeant Santos," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I had no idea. The things I said." Maria looked at him with eyes that held depths he was only beginning to understand. "You saw what you expected to see, Sergeant. A quiet mechanic who wouldn't fight back." "Why didn't you fight back?" Burke asked, genuine anguish in his voice. "You could have. I mean someone with your training." Maria was quiet for a long moment, considering how much truth to share. because fighting back would have meant revealing who I really was, and I wasn't ready for that. "Are you ready now?" Agent asked. Maria looked around the conference room, at the federal agents who owed their lives to her actions, at who was seeing her clearly for the first time, and at Burke, who was struggling to reconcile the woman he had mocked with the warrior who had saved them all. "I don't know," she admitted. "For 3 years I tried to be invisible. I fixed things that were broken and stayed out of sight, but maybe some things can't stay buried forever." Colonel stepped forward with a folder in his hands. "Sergeant Santos, I have new orders for you. The Pentagon is offering you a choice: return to special operations at your former rank with full honors, or accept a promotion to Master Sergeant and take command of a new training program for female special operations candidates." Maria took the folder but didn't open it. Instead, she looked around at the faces surrounding her federal agents who had witnessed her in action, fellow soldiers who were seeing her for the first time, and Burke, who was learning what it meant to truly know someone. "There's a third option," she said quietly. "I could go back to Fort Henderson and continue fixing things that are broken, because someone has to do that work, and it matters just as much as anything else." The room was silent as everyone processed her words. Here was a woman who could have chosen glory, recognition, and advancement, but was considering returning to the invisible work that had defined her for 3 years. "But," Maria continued, "I think I'm done being invisible." She opened the folder and read through the orders, her face impassive as she absorbed the details. When she looked up, there was something different in her eyes, not the hardness of a killer, but the quiet confidence of someone who had finally accepted who she was. "I'll take the training position," she said. "Someone needs to teach the next generation of female operators how to be ghosts when they need to be, and warriors when the time comes." As the federal agents began processing the scene, and the media started arriving outside, Maria found herself standing with and Burke in a quiet corner of the building. The 3 of them represented different aspects of her journey: the supervisor who had never really seen her, and the tormentor who was finally understanding what he had failed to recognize. "Sergeant Santos," Burke said, his voice heavy with shame and regret, "I owe you an apology that I'll never be able to give properly. The way I treated you, if I had known." "You shouldn't have needed to know," Maria replied gently. "Respect isn't something people have to earn through violence. It's something they deserve simply by being human." Burke nodded, tears in his eyes as he began to grasp the full weight of his actions. "How do I make this right?" Maria considered the question, thinking about the months of casual cruelty and the deeper prejudices that had made it possible. "You start by treating the next Maria Santos you meet with the respect she deserves, whether she's a mechanic, a cook, or a general. You look past the uniform and see the person." As they prepared to leave the federal building, approached Maria with a question that had been bothering him. "Santos, why did you help fix her brakes that night? You could have just told her to take it to a regular mechanic." Maria smiled, and for the first time in years it reached her eyes. "Because someone had to fix what was broken, and that's what I do." 6 months later, Master Sergeant Maria Santos stood in front of her first class of female special operations candidates at Fort. The women who looked back at her were strong, determined, and ready to serve their country in the shadows. Some of them would become invisible when they needed to be, just as she had been. But they would also know, as she now did, that invisibility was a choice, not a prison. And when the time came to step into the light, they would be ready. The deadliest person on base was no longer hiding in maintenance. She was teaching the next generation how to be deadly when necessary and invisible when wise. And in small towns and military bases across America, other Maria Santos types were going about their quiet work, fixing things that were broken and waiting for their moment to step into the light. Some ghosts, Maria had learned, were meant to become legends.